talk a little about how you use that story to do fundraising?
The question is, how did we use that story, the storytelling to get grants and support? We made the argument that Virginia history is so important to the American experience that we need to share that story with more people. And the way we were doing it was we were just not doing a very good job of that. So we came up, our takeaway was that everybody who comes to the Virginia Historical Society and goes through the story of Virginia will have an understanding of the significance that Virginia played in the history of the United States. And you could make that argument going through Kansas. What role has Kansas played in the American experience? And when we would bring corporations in, we would emphasize what we were trying to do in terms of telling that story, particularly with school groups. And we had a lot of foundations who set up what we call tour scholarships, where they would pay the cost of those schools coming in, and it was a way of bringing revenue into the Historical Society using that storytelling. But if we had gone through to certain foundations and said we just want them to look at the objects and not really tell a story, I don't think it would have worked. Every object is a teaching tool, and every object has a story to tell. And I think it's up to you to decide what that story is, working as a group. And I think it can be a very compelling story. Oh gosh, I'm sorry for that. She's trying to follow me around. I'm making it very hard on her.
It's okay.
I heard you speak once about fundraising, and you talked about the importance of storytelling.
Yes.
And you were you used an example of a sword, I think,
Yeah.
and a collection storage project.
Yeah.
You say, well, who's going to pay for collection storage?
Yeah.
It's just not exciting. We need to come up with a story.
You want me to tell that?
Yeah, do you mind? Because it really brought home to me that fundraising isn't just about like slippery pitches. It's sincere and it's about passion.
Well, when we raised about $110 million over a period of time, and we would have show and tell luncheons, and people would come in. And the sword she talked about belonged to General George H. Thomas, born and raised in Southampton, Virginia. Was a slaveholding family, came close to being killed during the Nat Turner Rebellion. But when 1861 came along, he was an officer in the Federal Army. He made the decision that he would remain loyal to the Union as opposed to go with the Confederacy. He'd been presented this beautiful sword by the citizens of Southampton County. And, but he remained loyal to the Union and became one of the great generals of the Union Army during the Civil War, the Rock of Chickamauga. He had left that sword with his sisters before the war, and after the war he asked them to return it to him. They wouldn't do it because they said, our brother, as far as we're concerned, our brother died in 1861. Well, they eventually gave that sword to the Virginia Historical Society, and I would have it with white gloves and show our donors and would tell that story, and they just, you know, it brought it alive. And we said, this is a story that needs to be told. It's been in a box in the basement. We want to bring it out and tell a story. And that was and we told other stories as well. About when the Historical Society became much more visible, our collections started growing in leaps and bounds. People knew that we were there, and they started bringing them in, and we started running out of space. We desperately needed collection storage. How do you sell collection storage? So we came up with an idea, and it worked. And I gave a talk called, Why is it in Virginia we forget there's any history after Appomattox? It's all colonial and Civil War. But some of the most significant changes occurred in the 20th century. And we are not doing our job unless we start collecting the history of the 20th century. And much of that history is corporate history. The rise of corporations and Fortune 500 companies. So we said in this new wing, we will set up a business history center with a gallery and a meeting space and so on and so forth. That was about 20% of the new wing. 80% of the wing was collection storage. And it was not dishonest, but it was just a way that we need the space. So we put all of our 20th century and corporate collections in the new wing, and it was a $50 million campaign. We raised 55 to pull it off. But they're just ways of using your history and pointing out a need that needs to be addressed. in doing your mission or whatever, what need needs to be addressed and how can we meet that need? Yes,
Do you have any ideas how we could tap into the education system like our museum has in Mobile, Alabama? And assuming our wonderful delegates that are present today are going to develop an Alabama story, an American history there, do you have any ideas how we could tap into, say, would it be fourth grade history or eighth grade? I know.
I tell you.
The other thing I want to say is, anybody tell you you look like George Bush?
No, they haven't. I've been told a lot of things, but what we did at the Historical Society was to we formed a Teachers Advisory Group, which was invaluable to us. And these were teachers from public schools, independent schools, and they met 4 times a year. And whenever we would launch a major exhibition, we would sit down with them. Is this going to work? Because in Virginia, as Brantley and other people in Virginia know, the standards of learning, you don't do anything without looking at the standards of learning. You can come up with the most wonderful exhibition or program in the world, and if it doesn't help fulfill those standards of learning, you've wasted your time in terms of reaching school kids. So this Teachers Advisory Group, we sat down with them. What is it you need? We have this. What can we provide you with? And it really helped us a lot. And I would strongly advise you to do that if you do not have one. And even, well, of course, your board system is a little different. We advise people to bring someone who has experience in the classroom on your board, or at least onto an honorary committee, because those people are valuable. We had a group in from the Henry Ford House in Grosse Pointe, Michigan the other day. And Henry Ford House is Fairlane. You remember the Ford Fairlane model? It's named for Henry Ford's house. Anyway, it's been turned back over to the Ford family, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And they asked me a question and said, we're looking for a good museum educator. What should we do? And I said, you know what I would do? I would go through and find out teachers in the classroom who have won awards, Best Teaching Award, and go after them and hire that teacher and bring them in. They can learn the museum system, but they know, they have firsthand knowledge of what works in the classroom. So there are a number of ways you can address that.
If they could bring their children in on a certain day at a certain time to your museum, that will, your numbers will skyrocket.
Right. Yeah, so speaking of that, look at that chart I handed out to you. History grows with age. I want to go over that with you. This was based somewhat on a book that came out about 12 years ago by Roy Rosenweg and David Thielen called Presidents of the Past. But I've done some follow-up work on this and interviewed close to 100 people about their interest in history. And here's what I found. That kids, little kids, up until they're about 12 or 13 years old, they don't know it, but they play history. Pirates, cowboys and Indians, I did. And then when they hit the teen years, whoo, puberty drops, hits, and boys and girls become interested in cars and, part-time jobs, and they're not thinking of the past, and they don't have a past to speak of. Then people get into their 20s and 30s, they're starting a new job, a new career, families, they're taking their kids to soccer games. It's not that they're not interested in history, it's just not there. There's so many other things going on in their lives. This is what I call the Children's Museum and the Science Museum crowd. And you're taking your kids to things that are very active. But then you reach mid to late 40s, and the curve begins to go up. And we find this with so many people. And interviewing people say, I hated history. I had to coach in high school, and he ruined it for me. It was nothing but dull, dry facts and just boring as it could be. But all of a sudden, I've got very interested in history. And that's one of the reasons that when you go to a historical society meeting or a colonial dames meeting, most people have gray hair, white hair, or no hair. Because the interest is there. And they're starting to put their own lives in perspectives. They've lost their grandfather. Why didn't I ask Granddaddy about such and such? I only asked him. I'm going to see what I can find out about him. And they get interested in genealogy. People doing Ancestor.com, it's mostly people over 50. And they're beginning to put their lives in perspective. Thank you. Jen, it's, so I think there's an opportunity there. There's a tendency to say, you know, we have to get more young adults involved and young families. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think you're going up against something that is hard for them to break away from. And you have this growing group with the baby boom generation. That group is going to get even bigger. And many of these people have the resources. And one thing we're talking about, and Dan and I are talking about, is building a bridge between the two peaks, the gray and the young, and developing what we call grand tours, programs bringing grandparents together with children. And whether it's a trip, a weekend activity, a week summer camp, I think Stratford Hall is doing this now, and a lot of organizations are beginning to do this. So if you look at that chart, there you try to think about ways of building that bridge. And we're seeing Talk Tours, for example, they have grand tours. It's a whole program of grandparents and their young people. Read up on that and see if you all can tap into that. But I pass that on to show you that history grows with age. Yes?
I worked for Historic Savannah 30 years ago, a
Uh-huh.
long time ago. And we increased our membership by 2/3 by taking the story of Historic Savannah out to people who didn't live in the historic district.
Uh-huh.
Is that still relevant, or is it basically more the web now, or do you do both? I don't know.
How did you take it out to
We
them?
had a sort of horse and pony show, we
Yeah.
called it a slideshow, and
Yeah.
we had a story that made it relevant to people who didn't live in the
Yeah,
historic
yeah.
district. But I don't know if you.
I think it's gotten to the point you have to do both, maybe not as much out on your own, but there's nothing more effective than having a live person speak to live people. And being there, you know, you could sit and do this watching a DVD, but it's not as effective. You don't have the personal feeling and sense of give and take that you do. So I would recommend that we did that at the VHS. We went on the road all around Virginia. And then we'll forget, I shouldn't tell you this, but we had an event in Lynchburg, and we would always take a curator with some of our rare objects, and we had some Daniel Boone materials, and we had them on a low table. And a gentleman came in who was blind, and he had a seeing eye dog. And they were all, and the dog turned around and his tail was wagging. And the manuscript started flying, and that was, you don't want that to happen. But I think that's an effective way of getting people to see firsthand what you're trying to do. And yes.
Speak a little bit about how to make American history more relevant to to our increasingly diverse population. I think primarily, ethnically and racially diverse, because we will become a majority non-white country
Exactly.
in the next 30 years.
Absolutely.
And I think so often colonial history is perceived as white history.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good point. We've been talking to some people in St. Augustine. I was this morning, and there's a perfect opportunity. When you think about it, colonial history is only, American colonial history is one part of a huge story, and that is the clash of empires in the New World. Spain was here first. Why was Jamestown established? In large part because the Spanish had established St. Augustine. And we need an outpost in the New World, in North America, and because we're competing with Spain. The Dutch, we need to establish an outpost. They go to New York. And I think with colonial history, if you don't do it in isolation, you can make it much more interesting. We did a major exhibit at the Virginia Historical Society called Jamestown, Quebec, Santa Fe. Jamestown was 1607, Quebec was 1608, Santa Fe was 1609. 3 American beginnings. And we told the story, and it makes it much more interesting. You know, how did the English do it? How did the French do it? How did the Spanish do it? They were very different. And which one probably had the greatest, most long-term impact was obviously the English or the British. But it was a way, and we did have trilingual labels, French, Spanish, and English. It traveled around, it went to Canada. So there are ways of making, I think that makes for a much more interesting story. rather than this is just one isolated case. It's part of a much bigger story. I think there's a lot, and there's a lot of interesting things coming out in colonial history. I don't want to take too much time, but one of the most interesting books I've read in a long time was Charles Mann's 1491, What America Was Like on the Eve of Columbus's First Journey. It's a fascinating book. And it's just a creative way of looking at how the coming of Europeans changed America. And your house museum, if it's an 18th century, can help tell that story. Yes, Brandon?
Charlie, in September, there was a naturalization ceremony at Gunston Hall.
Yeah.
And Ford Bell, who is the president of the board of the American Alliance of Museums,
Yeah.
the AAM, spoke to the newly minted Americans and talked about the importance of museums and how they should take their families and go to museums because our collective heritage
Right.
and all different types of museums is represented.
Right.
And it was really moving. And he did such a good job as you have. And I think it's just making it relevant, making it a part of their story.
When you think about it, Graham, there's a lot of, history is not, people don't know it like they used to. And the history's going to hell in a handbasket in this country. Well, I found an account in the Richmond Whig of 1846, which said it lamented the melancholy ignorance of history in our society today. In 1918, half of the high school students in Texas flunk the American Standardized History exam. So it's nothing new. And I would imagine that in 1953, if you went around and stopped most people on the street and asked them their knowledge of American history, it's not any better than it is today. But there are more historical institutions and more opportunities to access history today than ever in our history. And we have done a really pretty good job in this country of preserving our past. Take, for example, neighborhoods. In the 50s and 60s, whole neighborhoods could be razed, torn down without anybody blinking an eye. That doesn't happen that much anymore. And I think, frankly, history is taught better, for the most part, in school than when I was taught. And what you do with your house museum is an important part of the American democratic experience. You may not have thought of that. But you're uncensored in what you can teach. And you look at countries where there is a tyrannical government, they either erase or keep history from the people. The Taliban, when they took over in Kabul in 1991, they went into the National Museum and Archives and emptied it. And they said, there's no place for these sentimental old things. But what we do is we preserve the past, we make it available to the public, we tell it like it is, without censorship. And therefore, museums, particularly history museums, are an important part of the American democratic experience. And you should be very proud that you're helping preserve that and making it available to the public.
Well, I just want to say the diversity question is something that we have addressed at a lot of museum workshops. I know we have a small museum and we have a camp that, we basically, if you have an historic house, it was built by someone. We have a camp that really deals with the early trades, and it is specifically done and funded for the diversity and the children that are needed. So we bring these children in. And I think everyone, we also have cooking, the biggest program we have is cooking for children, on a beehive oven from colonial times. I think there are creative ways that if you set a mission to do that, you can reach that.
It's interesting, in Belmore, about 7 or 8 years ago, they opened the downstairs. That has become more popular than the upstairs now. People want to see how these, I'm getting a signal that I need to move on. Anyway, one last thing. We interpret the collections inside. Do you ever talk about how the house was built? Do you share that? Where did the bricks come from? Where'd they get the wood? How did people get up so high? How could they take these heavy things upstairs? And kids love that. All right, we need to talk about wars.